that all of modern Jewish history begins with the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov famously said, "Hagola nimshechet b'shichcha." The exile is lengthened through forgetfulness. U'v'schira sod hagiula. But redemption, the secret of redemption, the seed of redemption, is through memory, is through remembering. So that the study of history, the study of Jewish history, and Jewish history can never, of course, be divorced from the larger trends in general history, cultural history, that the study of Jewish history, Zachor Yemot Olam, is somehow redemptive, is somehow meant to point towards the future. And the work of trying to translate and understand and internalize the messages of the past is itself becomes a form of Avodat Hashem, of serving God. My wife likes to tell a story that when she was in middle school, I think 7th or 8th grade, as they were assigned to write a paper about the history of Jerusalem. But the teacher insisted that the paper could only be 5 pages long. So it became something of a joke that you can't write the history of Jerusalem from its inception until today in only 5 pages. So whether this was actually the title of the paper or it was just the joke title of the paper was The History of Jerusalem from its inception until page 5. And a little bit I feel that's the disclaimer that we have to give at the beginning of any session like this. To deal with all of the trends in modern Jewish history and to try to make sense of them in whatever it is, 10 or 12 easy lessons is obviously not possible. And we're really only going to be touching the tip of the iceberg. And what I'd like to try to do, is to look almost maybe at 10 or 12 vignettes of topics. But let's be clear that we can't construct the entirety and unearth the entirety of all of modern Jewish history in the scope of what we'll be doing. As we go along, I know that again some of you are new. If you have a question, feel free to chat in the questions. Feel free to raise your hand and speak. I really, really, very strongly encourage everybody to make a little investment. It's not a lot of money. Go to your Radio Shack or go online to Amazon.com or whatever it is and buy yourself the cheapest possible webcam. The cheapest webcam is actually better than the more expensive webcam because it uses less bandwidth. It really enhances the experience for me as a teacher to be able to see you and look you in the eye and for each other. So if you have a webcam, please turn it on. If you don't have a webcam, please go out and treat yourself to and to all of us to a webcam. If as we go along anything is unclear to you, you want to ask a question privately, you can chat it into me. Privately. Obviously, can't stop for every chat along the way. At the end, I'll try to stay on to answer any questions. But if I use a term or if I describe something and you just don't know what it is that term means, so that I will try to be attentive to. Also, I'll just point out, and then we'll get going. On the panels on the side, you have a note panel, a notes panel, which is a notebook. That's your own private notebook. Whatever you write there and you save, that's saved on your own computer, and that's not shared publicly. And you feel free to make use of that. This image that we're looking at, these two iconic images, it's jarring to look at them on the same screen. Somehow encapsulates what the story of modern Jewish history is, and this in at least 2 ways. The story of modern Jewish history, although there are many trends that have to be looked at, both internal trends and trends as they relate between the Jewish people and the whole world. these two images encapsulate something. The yellow Star of David, the mark of the iconic image of all of anti-Semitism. Of course, it's not, but it just become that way. That's what icons do. They kind of capture, they take a complex idea and distill it into one logo or one kind of image. But the story of anti-Semitism is the story of the Jewish people in exile, the exile that the Baal Shem Tov spoke about. This question that wherever we were, any place on the planet, we were always under the thumb of someone else. And somehow we didn't completely belong. And the question, the Jewish question for those host societies is always, how do we fit in? How do the Jewish people fit in? How does the general society, who's in charge of ruling all of the people under it, how do they relate to the Jews? What are the Jews' rights within the larger society? What are their obligations within the society? How does their presence make us? I'm speaking in the voice of the non-Jewish society. How does the presence of these Jews make us feel? And the Jewish question is the question for Jewish history. How do we fit in to the larger society? How is the larger society going to treat us? How are they going to tolerate us? What are they going to demand of us? This question was such a perplexing question that the general society, although obviously there were periods throughout the medieval and modern eras, from the time that Jews went out into exile, there were periods of time where, sometimes for hundreds of years, where there was a convivencia, a living together, a dwelling together, that perhaps maybe nowhere more famously than in the golden age of Spain, but somehow things end up coming to a loggerhead, and it doesn't work out very well. And even that golden age of Spain ends rather abruptly in 1492 with the expulsion. Throughout European history, this Jewish question is perplexing to the general society with whom we interacted. Ad k'dei kach, until the point where the society, at least the society led by Nazi Germany, thought that they had a final solution. The final solution was what the Nazis thought was going to once and for all put an end to the question of what to do with the Jews, because it was finally going to get rid of these Jews by exterminating all of them, at least from every place that the Nazis were in control, and we know that they had aspirations to control everything. But the final solution was what was meant to be, in the eyes of its innovators, to be the last attempt to solve this thorny question that European society had been wrestling with for over 1,000 years. These two images, juxtaposed one to the other, force us to think about this. Force us to think about this question. One, the question of anti-Semitism, and the other, what we hope, what we pray, is actually the final solution. The final solution to the Jewish question is not this star, but this star. Is the Magen David, not the yellow star, but the blue and white star of the modern state of Israel, of the idea that the Jews returning to their homeland would somehow alleviate the problem of how Jewish and general society interact, because we would recreate an authentic Jewish society, and that would even have implications and repercussions for Jewish society that, for whatever reasons, sociological, historical, cultural, would continue to exist in the diaspora. These two images raise that whole host of questions. Now, these two images are remarkable both for the amount of time it took to get from one to the other, and on the other hand, depending on how you look at it, the brevity of time it took to get from one to the other. If we take the yellow star as an icon for the larger Jewish question and anti-Semitism, so it's the entire story of the moment the Jews go into exile and start to live in a host society until 1948. So that's a very long history indeed, almost 2,000 years. In the words of Hatikva Bat Shnot Alpayim, the 2,000-year-old hope that we would move in this direction. But if in fact we take this image in the more localized, even though Jewish patches and Jewish identity marks predated the Holocaust, of course, but if we take this as an iconic image of the Holocaust, it's remarkable to think that we moved from the Holocaust. When does the Holocaust begin? Does anybody know? What's the general starting date? Yeah, 1939. Thank you, Rafael Yehoshaphat. 1939, generally we think of it beginning officially with Kristallnacht. The idea that in 9 short years we would go from Kristallnacht to the establishment of the State of Israel. 9 years is nothing. I mean, certainly in historical perspective, 9 years is really nothing. And I mean, I've got a box full of junk here in my study that's been sitting around longer than that, waiting to get unpacked. I mean, 9 years is really a historical half a blink of an eye. So, in some senses, the story of these two images is a very, very, very long one indeed. And on the other hand, the juxtaposition of these two images is the story of Yeshuat Hashem Keheref Ayin, that really history can take dramatic turns very quickly. This evening, I want to just briefly address the question of what's modern about modern Jewish history. And then on our subsequent sessions, hopefully we'll be able to unpack some of the things that we're going to hint at tonight. We won't go into great detail, but we'll try to cover a lot of ground by way of introduction. The question of dating history, of breaking it down into periods, is something of a function of our definition of history, of what metacognitive assumptions we bring to our consideration and our study of history. To periodize history, to break it down into the ancient period, the medieval period, the modern period, or any other type of chopping it up is problematic. But history is really quite fluid, and it's a dynamic process, and it's never quite so unilinear. But what historians do is we retroactively break down things into periods, and we say, this was one period, and that was another period. We look back and we say there was an event, and that event can be pointed to as transformative, and everything that happened beforehand might have been characterized by one set of facts or assumptions or associations, and then everything that happened afterwards by a different set, so that as you're living it, you don't realize. Everybody thinks that they live in the modern era. The Rambam thought he lived in the modern era. Correct. Every modernity becomes ancient one day. In the Dark Ages, they thought they lived in the modern era. you know, at any point in history, you're always living on the cusp of the modern era. We who live in an age of remarkable technological advancements. You know, I'm not that old, and I remember somebody. I remember very clearly. I was on the in the library in Yeshiva University. This must have been sometime around 1992, and Shoshana Schechter, who's also one of our teachers on the Web Yeshiva, said to me, "I just sent my first email," and I said, "What's an email?" And now here we are conducting this class live and interactive over the internet. You can see me, I can see you, we can hear each other, we can instantaneously chat, and all of that in a very short amount of very short amount of time. So we tend to think that we're really very modern, and everybody that came before us was very primitive. But at any given point in time, if we could travel back in time, any point in time, the people there would think that they're really very modern, and they would look at the periods before them and say, "Oh, they were really a little bit backwards." Melvin raises a good point in the chat. I think he sent it to me privately, but he says that everyone believes that their generation is the most advanced that's ever lived. Surely that's the definition of modern. It's not just that they believe it; they are the most advanced that had ever lived, because they are, even if they're the pygmies, they're standing on the shoulders of giants. However, the question of when does modern Jewish history begin was, of course, addressed by all the great Jewish historians, and depending upon the assumptions that they make and what they're looking for and what they're looking at, they're going to point to different events. And we're going to survey some of them now, not in chronological order, but we'll come back and try to make sense of them. Heinrich Gretz, Zvi Gretz, who was one of the early great Jewish historians, he pointed to this event, which you can look at on this picture. This is a painting of the famous meeting between Lessing and Lavatar, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing and Johann Caspar Lavatar. This is Lessing, and standing here is Lavatar, and their meeting with Moses Mendelssohn, the famous Jew Mendelssohn. You can see, let me just make the picture bigger. You can see that the meeting is taking place over a chessboard, and there's a book at hand. This is a meeting which probably actually took place. You know, very often when we talk about like famous iconic events, they're almost often as not apocryphal. But this meeting apparently actually took place in 1754. This painting was made about 100 years later. This is a painting which was not made contemporaneous to the event. It was a painting that was made almost 100 years later, which tried to capture the event. But this encounter between Moses Mendelssohn and Lessing in the 1750s becomes the icon. These are all icons that we're looking at. They're images, or they're vignettes that kind of capture a larger set of notions. This becomes the image of the Enlightenment, of the Jewish Haskalah and the general European Enlightenment. The idea that a Jew, Moses Mendelssohn, who we'll talk about in greater depth as we move along, would reach a rank of a role as a philosopher of ideas. Yeah, Mendelssohn is here on the left in the red. Here's another picture of him, a portrait. Mendelssohn lives from 1729 to 1786. We'll talk about him in a second. But the idea that a Jew could reach the level of being one of the most significant philosophers in Europe and would hobnob, as it were, over a game of chess and talking about ideas with other great figures of the Enlightenment. This character Lessing, Gottfried Ephraim Lessing, who lived from 1729 to 1781, essentially a complete contemporary to Mendelssohn. He was a German writer and philosopher, and he was a playwright and an art critic, and he was one of the very, very significant figures in the European Enlightenment, and his writings very greatly influenced German literature and ideas, in the generations that followed. So Gretz, who's interested as a historian of ideas, of culture, of spiritual processes, points to this event in 1754 as the turning point, the opening of the modern period of Jewish history. There's this really very interesting book that came out a couple of years ago by an Israeli author named Amos Ilon. In English, the book is called The Pity of It All, A Portrait of the German Jewish Epoch, 1743 to 1933. And it's a really fascinating read. In Hebrew, the book the title is even more evocative. In Hebrew, the book is called Harequiem Hagirmani. How could it happen that Jews in less than 200 years, Jews go from being almost subhuman to being at the pinnacle of European culture? There wasn't a field of science, art, culture, business, anything in Germany and Europe that the Jews were not represented at the pinnacle. You name it: literature, music, medicine, science. Help me out here. Banking, industry, journalism, any field of endeavor, Jews were at the pinnacle. How did they go from being below second-class vermin to being at the pinnacle of the most cultured and learned society in history, and back again to being so subhuman that we can consider exterminating all of them the way we would get rid of a plague of rats that found their way into our kitchen? That's what this volume is dealing with, and it's done through painting portraits of great Jewish thinkers throughout the years. But great Jewish thinkers, but by Jewish, it has a very broad definition of Jewish. It includes, since it's speaking culturally, figures that convert. There were, of course, many conversions, but yet people that still continue to wrestle with questions of Judaism. So that's what this book deals with, and this is the introduction. This is the vignette that opens the introduction to this volume. Let's just look at it quickly for a few minutes. I'll just read. In the fall of 1743, a 14-year-old boy entered Berlin at the Rosensteller Tor, the only gate in the city wall through which Jews and adults were allowed to pass. The boy had arrived from his hometown of Dessau, some 100 miles away in the small independent principality of Dessau-Anhalt. For 5 or 6 days, he had walked through the hilly countryside to reach the Prussian capital. Remember, in this time period, this is before Bismarck unifies Germany. What we today call Germany is a collection of different districts and city-states. It's not one unified nation. So Berlin is the capital of the Prussian region. We do not know whether he was wearing shoes, this 14-year-old boy. It's more likely that he was barefoot. The boy, later famous throughout Europe as the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, his name was Moshe ben Mendel, that's how he gets the name, from Dessau. He was frail and sickly, small for his age. Early years of poverty had left him with thin arms and legs, an awkward stutter, and a badly humped back. You may have seen that in the picture. The hump may have been the result of genetic disorder, or it may have been caused by rickets, a common childhood disease at the time. The boy's overall appearance would have moved the cruelest hearts to pity. And yet his face was remarkably attractive. Under the finely arched forehead, his eyes were deep and sparkling, his nose, cheeks, lips, and chin delicate and well-formed. The boy was all but penniless and traveled alone, carrying his few possessions and a satchel on his hunched back. In 1743, the movements of Jews, many of whom were wandering peddlers, were tightly regulated and controlled. Only a limited number of rich Jews, and occasionally a scholar, were allowed to settle in Berlin. Essentially, in principle, Berlin was off limits to Jews unless there was some reason that they would let you in. But peddlers were barred, peddlers being the lowest of the low. Jews requested admission to Berlin, even for only a few days. Jews requesting permission to Berlin, any Jew that requested permission to Berlin, even for only a few days, were sternly interrogated as to their background and purpose. If temporarily admitted, they were rejolt, that is, subject to a commodity tax, as though they were merchandise being imported, at the same rate as imported Polish oxen. The gatekeeper's task, according to one report, was to stop and register all incoming Jews, keep an eye on them during their stay, and expel the foreign ones as soon as possible. Prussia, under the enlightened despot Frederick II, we'll talk about him again in a second, Frederick the Great, was relatively speaking more tolerant than most other German states. The official disposition was to regard most Jews and all serfs as less than human. The gatekeeper's surviving log for 1743, the year Mendelssohn trudged through the Rosenthal Gate, includes this notation. Today, there passed 6 oxen, 7 swine, and a Jew. Several versions of what transpired during Mendelssohn's interrogation have passed down. According to one, the gatekeeper teased the young hunchback, suspecting him of being another peddler. Jew, what are you selling? And they want to buy something from you. Mendelssohn is said to have responded, you'll never want to buy anything from me. Out with it! Tell me what you deal in, the gatekeeper insisted. In reason, the boy stuttered. According to another account, Mendelssohn was asked what he wanted in Berlin. His answer was to learn. Now, these, of course, are apocryphal tales, but apocryphal tales are the powerful stuff by which we construct meaning in history, which is not apocryphal. The advent of Moses Mendelssohn, who is not a figure without controversy, is not a figure about whom we don't relate to with some level of ambivalence, not because of him personally, but because of movements that came in his wake, which we'll discuss. But the arrival of Moses Mendelssohn in Berlin, the encounter with, in other words, what he achieved in his career and his encounter with general society, it becomes an event of such significance that we can point to it and say that's the beginning of modern Jewish history. Other philosophers, other historians point to other events. Dubnov, for example, if you live in or around, or if you ever visit us in the offices of Web Yeshiva, which are in Talbia, was surrounded by streets that are named after all these historians, Dubnov and Gretz, etc. So Dubnov was of the opinion, he was more of a political historian. He points to the French Revolution. The French Revolution, 1789. Louis XVI was the King of France in 1789. Perhaps you remember that from grade school. What's significant about the French Revolution for the purposes of Jewish history? Have a guess? Feel free to speak up. If you want a microphone, we'll pass you a microphone. Why is the French Revolution significant for Jewish history? Jewish freedom. What do you mean by that, Rafael? Rafi, what do you mean by that? Got it. Can you speak? You have a microphone, Rafi?
Hello?
Hi.
I mean that Jewish emancipation, the French Revolution led to the Jewish people getting their rights, which eventually led to the emancipation and the assimilation of many Jewish people, and that's what later led to the Holocaust, and that's what led to the state of Israel.
Okay, you're certainly condensing a lot of different events into one sentence, but the French Revolution, which is the most significant political result or immediate political result of the European Enlightenment, liberté, égalité, fraternité. There you have it. That all citizens are somehow equal. And that is going to include even the Jew. So the idea of emancipation, that the Jew should be emancipated. Now, it's not exactly like we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States in the 1860s, where you had chattel slavery, where all blacks, all African Americans, well, they weren't African Americans, they were black slaves, become African Americans. They become emancipated. They're freed from being slaves. Jews were technically slaves in that sense, but neither were they citizens. Neither did they have equal protection under the law, and neither did they have the same set of rights that the citizens of the host countries had. And with the French Revolution, the Jews are given rights, they're emancipated, and that leads to a series of developments, which Rafi kind of, oversimplified into one sentence, but, which is essentially true. The question of a Jew's relationship to his faith, to observance, to traditional forms of authority in the Jewish community are now all open to question. In the chat, somebody jotted down Out of the Ghetto, which is the name of a wonderful, wonderful book by the historian Jacob Katz, which exactly puts its finger on this topic. The Jew leaving the ghetto. The ghetto, of course, was a terrible place, but the entree into general society brought with it a host of questions about the role of traditional society, which become part of the complexity of the modern world. Since I mentioned the ghetto, I'll just tell you as an aside, on the website, on our Shear's homepage, if you're not sure how to get that, email us and we'll make it clear to you that it's there when you log on. I've uploaded a number of documents, including some maps that you might want to refer to, and a general kind of timeline of major events in modern Jewish history. Now there's a whole other notion of what modern Jewish history is about and when it begins. The historian Dinur, Ben Zion Dinur, great Zionist historian, and he became an Israeli politician in the early years of the state. He was one of the first ministers of education. He filled other positions here in Israel. So he points to an earlier date, and he's not looking to the European Haskalah, and he's not looking to the emancipation of the Jews, but he chooses a watershed event in a different direction. Again, everybody brings their own assumptions to the table, and he says, no, you know when modern Jewish history begins? It begins in 1700, a little earlier than the other figures. In 1700, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, who was a very interesting figure, perhaps we'll come back to him, he leads the first organized band of Jews, of followers of his, to Israel. A kind of a mass aliyah, not the first aliyah, but the proto-aliyah. The idea that a group of European Jews were going to pick up, they were going to leave Europe, and they were going to settle in Eretz Yisrael. They were going to return to the land. He's a very significant, let's call him a proto-Zionist. To be clear, Jews in exile were always Zionists. 3 times a day, from the day that we left Eretz Yisrael after Churban Abayit, we would face Jerusalem wherever we were, and we would talk about returning there. But Zionism as a kind of organized social or political movement can find its earliest traces here. This Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid leads this band of Olim. He lived from about the mid-17th century, and he died in 1700. He started off with a couple of dozen families, and as they went along, more people joined them. It's kind of like a parallel lahavdil to the Crusades. A group of fervent Christians would leave Western Europe, would leave France or England, and make their way across Europe, going to free the Holy Land from the infidels, and people would join the bands as they go along. So lahavdil, although Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid and his followers didn't slaughter anyone in the wake of their journey, of course, but by the time they arrive in Israel, there's, by different accounts, there are quite a few hundred, perhaps even as many as 1,500 people. Unfortunately, Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid died upon arrival. He contracted some kind of disease, and unfortunately, many of the followers also didn't fare very well, and that, combined with the general lack of resources or ability to feed themselves, kind of made the whole thing a little bit unsuccessful, although there were some people that did make it, and there's still people in Yerushalayim today that trace their ancestry back to the Olim that came to Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. But what was significant about this was the organized attempt to get back to Eretz Yisrael. So that's maybe a different. And again, each of these, there's no right, there's no wrong answer. There are different accretions of ways of looking at the different trends in modern Jewish history and trying to find the origins. Sherry asks about conversos who made their way to Israel, to Tzfat and elsewhere, even earlier. Yeah, it's true. Even in the 16th century, there were conversos. What was significant about this was the idea of an organized group, the idea that Jews would bandy together to come and settle the land. That's what's significant about it. There were always Jews, coming and going. The Ramban in the 13th century came on Aliyah. And when they got here, they'd find people to live with. And very often people would live with people that came from the Altaheim, the old town. And they'd form Landsmannschaften, and they would, help support each other. They'd speak the same language, as it were. But what was significant here was the idea of some kind of organized group, which is a foreshadowing to types of organized Aliyah and political Zionism. There are other historians that point to another very significant event, this even earlier, in the mid-17th century, and that is the career of Shabtai Tzvi. Perhaps we'll talk about him as well, and I assume that if the name is familiar to you, that Shabtai Tzvi was a rather colorful figure who declared himself the Messiah, and actually a very large number of people believed that he was in fact the Messiah until he unfortunately converted to Islam. And for most people, most of the people that did believe that he was in fact the Messiah, Mashiach, that kind of, basically convinced them that they were mistaken. Although surprisingly, there were bands of people that continued to believe in him, and that belief amongst certain groups of people lasted for quite a while. The career of Shabtai Tzvi and how it could be that this charlatan could pull off this trick, we'll talk about subsequently. But that episode leads to a kind of antinomian mood. It might be greases the wheels, let's say, of some trends that will come afterwards about how people think about commitment to Torah and mitzvot and to rabbinic authority. It also comes on the heels of a terrible, terrible catastrophe, which may have actually fueled the flames and created the circumstances by which people believed that Shabtai Tzvi was the Mashiach, and those are the famous Zerot Tach V'Tat. I'm sorry, that didn't come out clearly on the screen. Zerot Tach V'Tat were a series of pogroms that swept Eastern Europe in what today is the Ukraine, in Poland, in 1648 and 1649, in the years preceding Shabtai Tzvi, which were the worst pogroms up until that point. There were those pogroms in history until, of course, they were overshadowed by the Holocaust, and that feeling of despair in the wake of those pogroms and the dislocation that was caused by that and the destruction of the communities created an environment in which Shabtai Tzvi was able to sell his snake oil, as it were. There are different ways to look at history as well. There are ways to look at it. Most of these opinions until now have been looking at larger trends in general society, like the Enlightenment, like the French Revolution, seeing how it impacts on the Jewish community, and then pointing to that and saying, see, that's the turning point. But you can look in a more internal way at something, let's say, like the history of halakha. That the history of the Jewish people is very much a history of how the Jewish people conceive of themselves in their relationship to God, their observance of mitzvot. So you can point to an even earlier time period, the period of Yosef Karo, who was a descendant of people that were exiled from Spain in 1492, and did come to Tzfat, as I think Sherry mentioned. And in Tzfat, in the 16th century, he authors This is Rav Yosef Karo. I mean, this may or may not actually be his real picture, but it's a picture that we say is Rav Yosef Karo. Rav Yosef Karo is also called HaMechaber, the author of the monumental Shulchan Aruch, that great encyclopedia and code of Jewish law, which becomes the defining word for what religious observance is until our day. And even though we need a whole body of literature to try to make applications of the principles of the Shulchan Aruch to modern day questions, the starting point is, of course, always the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch and its the Mechaber and his companion, the Ramah of Moshe Isserlis, who was in Europe, who was in Poland, and spoke on behalf of Ashkenazic practice, Yosef Karo being a Sfaradi. These two together, not exactly co-authors, because Yosef Karo wrote the Shulchan Aruch, and immediately the Ramah wrote glosses on the Shulchan Aruch to kind of square the practice in any event that the Ashkenazic practice was different. The Shulchan Aruch becomes the defining work of codified halakha and marks a turning point. We point to the Shulchan Aruch as the division between the Rishonim and the Achronim, the authority of rabbinic writing, the authority of halachic decision turns with the publication of the Shulchan Aruch, and in many ways, the nature of rabbinic learning and decision making and halakha takes on a new form afterwards, which leads up until our period. The events that follow the Shulchan Aruch, like Gzerot Tach, a little less than 100 years later, cement the Shulchan Aruch as the definitive work. Because in a period where communities are wiped out, where yeshivot are destroyed, where rabbis are slaughtered, where families are dispersed, to have a repository of Jewish law in a book that you could carry with you, that you could point to on a shelf, becomes even more important in the wake of the type of dispersion and destruction that are experienced. Some point to, we saw earlier in the discussion of the Enlightenment, some point to this figure. He's not a Jewish figure. He doesn't look very Jewish. He looks something like George Washington, and that might be because he was, more or less a contemporary, a little bit older. This is Frederick II of Prussia, also known as Frederick the Great. Frederick the Gross, also known as the Alter Fritz, Old Fritz. He was this, semi-enlightened 18th century leader of what we think of as Germany, and the ascent of Frederick the Great to the throne in 1740 leads to a real fanning of the flames of the Enlightenment spirit. It's an interesting question. What was going on in Europe in the 18th century? Was there something in the water that all of a sudden what we call the Enlightenment, these notions become the stock in trade of what's happening in Europe? You have, a figure a little earlier like John Locke writing things about natural rights, about the dignity of the human being, about the rights that he's endowed with. That's going to influence everything throughout Europe. That's an interesting question, and many people have written about this. That's a larger question in general history. I'm sure 10 seconds of Googling, will provide you with more reading material on this question than you probably want. But even if you just survey the encyclopedia article on on the Enlightenment, you'll discover a lot of thought on this particular question. But again, choosing an arbitrary moment to point to the arrival of Frederick the Great on the throne and his limited open-mindedness, but his open-mindedness to these types of questions lead to a shift from increased participation by Jews in German cultural life and European cultural life, increased rights for Jews, which calls into question these matters of authority, and therefore, if we want to look at what modern Jewish history is about, well, we've been speaking about Europe until now, and we'll probably do a lot of that for the rest of our time together. But really, the place to look is right here in the Declaration of Independence. Now, I know that many of you are Americans. I know that many of you are actually right now in the United States of America, and this is all old hat. We learned this in grammar school. But even though these ideas that we've been talking about, these trends in European thought, are in Europe, the first real embodiment of it actually takes place in North America. Because in North America, we didn't have a king. We had a king, but he was, all the way across the ocean. And much of what Jefferson is writing in this document is about how that guy over there in England is not so good and hasn't treated us properly, and that's why we have to declare our independence. But this is the first embodiment of those ideals. So when Jefferson, speaking on behalf of the Congress, writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal." There you have it. All men are created equal. And all men included Jews. That they're endowed or created by certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. The purpose of government is to make sure that all of the created equals get their fair share, and that the government is not headed by a king who sits there through some notion of divine right, but the government derives its power from the consent of the governed, that the people are sovereign. And whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it's the right of the people to alter it or abolish it. So the King of England, George III, is not fulfilling his responsibilities to us, and therefore we're going to sever our ties, and we're going to create our own nation, which will try to affect safety and happiness. Now, it's true that this extraordinarily radical and important idea was executed only in a limited way. All men are created equal, women less so, and blacks not at all. That was likely for various economic reasons, but the Jew benefited from this. Now, the Jews in North America in the 18th century, there weren't all that many of them, but the notion of equality, which kind of willy-nilly had to include the Jew, is remarkable. It's a trick question. Like, where were the Jews first emancipated? Where were the Jews first emancipated? So the answer is in the United States of America. I mean, only by default. North American society didn't really spend much time thinking about the Jewish question. It kind of happened piggybacked to the revolution. But in fact, the Jews were first emancipated in the sense that the first place where Jews were recognized as equal citizens with full rights was in the United States of America from its very moment of establishment. And this comes out of these notions of the European Enlightenment. The Constitution is made in the name of we the people, that the people are sovereign. And a few years later, it's ironic because the ideas originate in Europe, have their impact in North America, and then it's only in 1789 in France that they're actually first put into practice in this way with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which is a radical notion. And here's this little image, you know, is this image of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, you know, which is obviously meant to be inspired by the notion of the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, of the Ten Commandments. Among the points in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen are, again, that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. The aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. Right? The whole reason there's a government is to protect the individual, instead of the ancien regime, the previous notion that the purpose of having a society was to serve a king who rules with some type of divine right. The rights are liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression. Later on in the Declaration, no one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including his religious views. Again, this is a big innovation, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. This is something the French to this day are still quite concerned with, and you can look in the newspapers. The free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious of the rights of men. These are notions which in America get embodied in the Bill of Rights, that every citizen may accordingly speak, write, print with freedom, shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom and as shall be defined by law. That with these rights and freedoms come a time where people can think and write and explore new ideas, and all of this would be a tremendous boon to the Jew, but would also provide serious challenges to religious life and society. Allow me just another minute or two to sum up, and then I'll be happy to stay online if anybody has any questions. The assembly in France, they didn't necessarily want to grant emancipation to Jews. That wasn't their agenda. But they had to do it in order to avoid a certain amount of hypocrisy. The fact that America included the Jew under all men are created equal and didn't include the women, didn't include the black man, that's like an oddity of perhaps of economic history. The problem with all of this, if we put all of these different opinions together, these whatever it is, 7 or 8 different opinions, we would find a constellation of trends, of issues that some that fit more closely together, others that are more off in the margin, and we would see that something, let's say generally around the mid-18th century, is happening, and that changes the dynamic of Jewish life and Jewish history. And this ushers in the modern period, and this poses various challenges, and this raises all types of questions. However, it's not quite so neat, because however we periodize modern Jewish history, it doesn't cut neatly across all different types of chronological or geographical lines. Most of Moses Mendelssohn's contemporaries, 99.9% of them, were not modern by any standard by any standard definition. And everything that we're talking about is limited to European Jewry, and perhaps those few in North America. But Jews in Yemen, Jews in Iraq, and what today is Iraq, Jews elsewhere in the world, Jews in Ethiopia, none of this applies to them. They don't enter the modern era with all of the slew of issues that we're talking about until the 20th century. Some of them until the mid or even late 20th century. So the problem with looking to these watershed events is that they have meaning for the people that are there at the watershed, but they don't really have much meaning for other communities or other Jewries. And fortunately or unfortunately, probably unfortunately, at least in our survey this semester, we're going to be looking at trends and events in European Jewish history. There's no doubt that history will look at our era as whatever it is, as postmodern, that either the Holocaust or the establishment of the State of Israel, or probably the coincidence of both of them in a short amount of time, will again be looked to as one of these turning point events. And they'll look at whenever modern Jewish history begins, some point in the 18th century up until the 1940s as one period. And then we, all of us, I believe, born after then, or if not immediately after, then shortly before, we will be living in the modern era, and we'll have to have a different name for everything that happened during those 300 years, from let's say 1740s until 200 years, 1740s till the 1940s. That'll have to have a different name. We'll be taking nominations for what to call that period of history. But the crescendo of anti-Semitism climaxing with the Holocaust, and the radical break with 2,000 years of exile with the return to Israel, no doubt is a turning point in modern Jewish history. Next time we'll look at some events or some trends that happen on the cusp. What was Jewish life like in Europe when the modern era arrives, whenever it does? If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll put my email up in the box. Feel free to email me during the week, and we will. Yeah, I just put it up in the box. Feel free to email me during the week. Feel free to visit the website for some of these